Could we tomorrow go to Mincha Maariv Shiur?
Yeah, sure. What time?
The same thing like before.
Not the time, but tomorrow not here.
So maybe Wednesday?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. By the way,
You're on being recorded.
Ruby Carson lost another
Yeah,
sister.
yes, sir.
Chodesh Tov, everyone. First mitzvah in the Torah appears in this week's Parsha Bo. Chodesh hazeh lachem, Rosh Chodoshim hu, Rishon hu lachem lechodshei Hashana, which introduces us to the idea of the Jewish calendar. The Jewish calendar differs from the secular calendar and from the Muslim calendar and from the calendar in the Orient, India, others. So there are two separate periods of time regarding the calculation of the calendar in halacha. One, the Gemara teaches us in the Gemara Rosh Hashanah, is al pi ariyah. Now, so let's start from the beginning. HaChodesh hazeh lachem. The calendar is given over to you. Anything that's given over to human beings is not perfect. The perfection escapes us. So the Torah tells us in advance, whatever happens here is not going to be perfect. It'll be practical, but not perfect. Now, the Hebrew calendar, the Jewish calendar, is based on the moon. It's a lunar calendar. The moon waxes and wanes every month. So the amount of time that the moon takes to, so to speak, be born, then go dark, and then be born again, is 29 days and 11 hours and a fraction. It's like 29 and a half days. Well, we can't have 29 and a half days in a month. So the solution is simple. You have 29 days for 6 months, and you have 30 days for the other 6 months, and that adds up to the 12 months, and that averages 29 and a half days. How do you know when to start? So there is something that is called the molad, which the Gaboyim announce every Shabbos Mevorchim. The molad is when the first crack of the sliver of the moon becomes available to be seen in Yerushalayim. And at the time of the first Beis Hamikdash, and at the time of the second Beis Hamikdash, the molad was established by witnesses who came So, for instance, when 29 days passed, Bezdin had a group of people scattered throughout looking at the sky. And if two of them saw the sliver of the moon, they would immediately come to the Bet Din, and the Bet Din would examine them, the whole Gemara there, the how, what, where. Ram Gamliel even had models of the moon made that he could show so that they could identify what they saw. And then Bezdin would declare Mekudesh HaChodesh, Mekudesh HaChodesh. Today is Rosh Chodesh. Now, it could be that they were wrong. It's possible. And certainly in exactitude, they're undoubtedly wrong, because we're talking here about fractions of a second. And they had no means of measuring time in that fashion. But because of the fact of Achodesh Hazel Lochem, I've given this over to you, Kavi Yochel Rabbanu Shalom says, which is a great concept in Torah, by the way. Torah is what the great men of Torah say it is. And Chazal say, Lachem is afilu mezidim, afilu mutoim, even if they purposely didn't do it correctly, even if they made a mistake. Bezdin said, Mekudesh HaChodesh, Mekudesh HaChodesh. And that naturally has an effect on all other mitzvahs. Because if you know when Rosh Chodesh is, then you know when Pesach is. You know when to eat matzah and when not to eat matzah. And all of the other holidays. And that was the system as long as the Sanhedrin existed. So even after the Churban Bayesheni, in the time of the later Tanoim, that was still the system. The Sanhedrin moved to Usha, it moved to Shfaram, it moved in the Galil, it moved 10 times, Tveria. But the system was that you came to the Sanhedrin and they were the ones that made the Rosh Chodesh. Then we read in the Gemara that they had a whole system of how to inform the Jews in Bavel. That was the main Golus. As to when Rosh Chodesh was, they had a system of bonfires from the high mountain of Yerushalayim to Sarbata, to other mountains along the way, and then not Sheheir Kol HaMizrach. They saw all the bonfires, so then they knew that Bezdin had made Rosh Chodesh. So that was the original system. What happened was a number of things. One was Kilkulu the Minim. The early Christians, there were renegade Jews, there were the descendants of the Tzdokim who did not want to accept the authority of the Sanhedrin, the authority of Torah Shebaal Peh, and therefore they made fake bonfires so that you could no longer rely on the fact that there were bonfires burning, that was going to be Rosh Chodesh, because they made bonfires a day early or a day late, or they couldn't rely on it anymore. So in the beginning of the 5th century, the rabbis switched. The Sanhedrin switched to mathematical calculation, to what we call the permanent calendar, which is based upon astronomy and mathematics. and is not based on witnesses coming and seeing what they saw. It's based on the fact that we now mathematically can calculate when the molad is. And that's what we announce every Rosh Chodesh, Mevorchim HaChodesh. The Gabe announces the molad will be this and this and this. But that is not the true molad. That's only a practical molad. The true molad is not subject to that type of easy calculation. Nevertheless, because Achodesh Hazeh Lochem, it's given over to the Sanhedrin. So if they say that's the molad, even if they know that it's not the true molad. So we announce, this morning at 2 a.m., 10 minutes after 2, and 6 halakim. The minute in halacha is divided into 360 parts. It's called a chelek. We think of a minute divided into 60 seconds. But the truth of the matter is you can divide seconds again. Anyone that's watched American basketball knows that if you have 0.9 of a second, you can still win the game. This is an extraneous fact known only in this synagogue. So they announce how many chalokim. So again, it's not the true molad, but it's the practical molad. It's the molad upon which our calendar is based. Now, all of this would be fine if we followed a purely lunar calendar, the way the Muslims do. Because a purely lunar calendar has only 354 days in the year, whereas the solar calendar has 365 and a quarter days, approximately a quarter. Again, it's 5 hours and 59 and some minutes and some seconds, which is a different problem that the Gregorian calendar attempted to correct. See, everybody wants to have a perfect calendar, and nobody has it because time does not belong to us. So we can only deal with practical calendars. Practical calendars are always imperfect. So what do you do? The difference between 365 and a quarter days and 354 days, every year there's a difference of over 11 days. So we have another principle in halacha. Atem yotzim b'chodesh ha'aviv. The Jewish people left Egypt in the springtime, the month of spring in Nisan. Well, if you have a purely lunar calendar, Nisan can end up in January and December. Keep on going 11 days every year. After 3 years, you're off a month. After 6 years, you're off 2 months. So we have to reconcile the lunar calendar with the solar calendar. And for that, we have the system of this year of leap years, of Shna Sa'ibur. The sun and the moon are in a cycle of 19 years. Every 19 years, they are back in their original position, so to speak, relative to each other. Now, again, Today we can measure time in millionths of a second. So it's not perfect, but for our purposes, it's as close as human beings can be. So in the reconciliation between the two, every 19 years, 7 years will have an extra month. By adding the extra month within the 19-year cycle 7 times, you'll come out that the number of days in the Jewish calendar and the number of days in the solar calendar will approximately coincide. Now, again, it's not exact. So then the rabbis added another layer to this. And they said there are 2 months of the year that some years will be 29 days and some years will be 30 days. Cheshvan and Kislev. So sometimes they're 30 and sometimes they're 29, depending how we adjust the calendar to reconcile the solar calendar to the lunar calendar. And all of this was worked out in the permanent calendar that we have. And that's Sod Hashem Li'Reov, the great Talmidei Chachamim, even today, know what's going on. The Chazon Ish was famous for his knowledge of astronomy and mathematics and his treatise on the calendar, which I'm not going to get into it now, but which brings us to another problem, which is that of the international dateline. When does the day end? Where does it begin? The earth is round. It's night here, it's still morning in New York. It's the next day in Japan. So how do we deal with that? So that is a famous halachic discussion till our day. There were basic shittas. Rav Herzog was one, and the Chazon Ish was one, Rav Kasher was one, Rav Shlomo Zalman was all the great Gedolim had their theories about it, and there are differences. Till today, there are differences. If you go to Japan, what day is Shabbos? Is it the Japanese Saturday or is it the Japanese Sunday? So people who are scrupulously observant, such as me, I was in Japan once and I had no intention to go back a second time. And I had to be over Shabbat in, when I was with the OU, and I had to be over Shabbat in a town called Nara in Japan. It's a holy city. And so I'm only going to be once in my lifetime in Japan. So I had 2 days Shabbos, which is a long Shabbos. You can believe me, it's a long Shabbos. But that's a shaila. I know business people that go to Japan. When it comes Thursday, they take a flight to Korea, to Seoul. They spend Shabbos in Seoul because there everybody knows when Shabbos is, because Korea is attached to the Eurasian continent. And then Monday, they fly back to Japan to do business again. So all of this is involved in this simple 3 words, HaChodesh Hazeh Lochem. I give it over to you, God says. Anything that's given over to human beings is complicated, is imperfect, but it has to be practical. It has to work. And the greatness of Chazal is the fact that they established this permanent calendar and that it has stood the test of time. And even though we are aware that it is imperfect and that it's not exact, But because HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, that is what we follow, and that's the way it was. Just one more note. In the 9th century, there was a Rav in Yerushalayim, Ben Meir, who disputed the permanent calendar. And he said that Pesach is off a day, Rosh Hashanah is off a day, and he made his own calendar and he distributed amongst the Jewish people. So there were Jewish communities that followed him. So you had in one Jewish community, they were eating chametz, and the other one, they were only eating matzah. So you could not have that. So Rabbeinu Saadia Gaon defended the traditional calendar and forced Ben Meir to retract. But since that time, since the 9th century, there really has been no variant, to use a popular word today, in the question of the calendar, because we all realize the imperfection, but we realize that that's what their Rebbeinu Shalom gave it to us, the first mitzvah, HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem. Rabbi Chananya ben Akashia, Omer Rotz HaKadosh Baruch Hu L'Zakos Yisrael, L'fichach Hirba Lahem Torah Mitzvot Shenemar, Adonai Chavetz Aman Tzidko Yagdil Torah V'Yadir.